There are chapters of history that remain untouched not because they lack evidence, but because their silence is more convenient. Stories so thoroughly scrubbed from the record that what's missing speaks louder than what survives. In the spring of 1856, plantation logs in Greene County, Alabama, noted an anomaly no one could explain. 23 enslaved people disappeared in a single night. There were no signs of violence, no blood in the dirt, no torn fabric on barbed fences. At dawn, their cabins stood abandoned, hearths cold, beds untouched. But the real horror lay deeper. According to official records, none of those 23 people were alive to disappear. Their names had already been struck from the rolls. Death certificates had been signed. Burial sites marked. Causes of death neatly listed in plantation ledgers, complete with dates and locations in the cemetery beyond the cotton fields. And yet, on that April night, the dead walked away together. They were guided by a man who had escaped before Ayat Weiss. A man who had also died before Ayat Weiss. His name surfaces and vanishes in the archives, as if the ink itself couldn't decide whether to acknowledge him. A man who existed just long enough to disrupt the record, then fade again. His name was Marcus. This is the story of how one man discovered that sometimes survival demands becoming what your oppressors fear most, and not a rebel, not a criminal, but something far worse. A rumor, a shadow, a tale passed in whispers, impossible to confirm yet impossible to dismiss. What follows may sound unreal, but the documents are there. The places still exist. The dates align. And that is what makes it so unsettling. Because if this story is true, then for nearly 2 years a man officially listed as dead moved freely through the core of the Confederacy, orchestrating what may have been the most intricate escape ever attempted on American soil. And if it isn't true, then 23 people managed to stage their own deaths so completely that even those who claimed ownership of them were convinced. Either way, something or Somionia was haunting Greene County, Alabama. The question is, were they dead or just desperate enough to pretend? Part 1. Oh, Mundo Antisqueda, Greene County, Alabama in the 1850s was a place where cotton was king and human beings were currency. The county sat in the heart of the Black Belt. Named not for its population, but for its rich, dark soil that could grow cotton so thick and tall that enslaved workers would disappear completely between the rows, visible only by the white bolls moving as they picked. The soil was so dark it looked almost black when wet, staining hands and feet, seeping into every crack and crevice. Old times said the land had been sacred once before white settlers arrived. Creek and Choctaw people had lived here for thousands of years, burying their dead in mounds that still rose from the fields like ancient warnings. Some plantation owners built their homes on these mounds, claiming the elevated ground. Others avoided them, superstitious about disturbing whatever rested beneath. The Henderson plantation sprawled across 2,400 acres of this fertile land, positioned along the winding banks of the Warrior River. It was neither the largest nor the cruelest operation in the county, which somehow made it more insidious. There were plantations where the brutality was so extreme that enslaved people had nothing to lose by attempting escape. Henderson's neighbor to the south, a man named Josiah Crawford, was known for his viciousness. His enslaved workers bore scars like road maps, and the cemetery on his property was 3 times the size it should have been for a plantation his size. But Henderson ran his property with calculated efficiency. He provided adequate food, not generous, but enough to keep workers strong. Minimal medical care when absolutely necessary. He allowed families to stay together, permitted religious gatherings on Sundays, and rarely used the whip unless he deemed it unavoidable. Not out of kindness, but economics. Healthy workers produced more. Stable families ran away less. Helpless people worked harder than angry ones. James Henderson had inherited the plantation from his father in 1843 along with 62 enslaved people and a philosophy that treated human bondage as a business venture rather than a moral question. He kept meticulous records noting the value of each person, their skills, their health, their family connections. In his ledger, people were listed alongside livestock and equipment, their worth calculated with the same dispassionate precision he applied to calculating bales of cotton. The plantation itself was impressive in the way that monuments to cruelty often are. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white painted with columns that caught the morning sun and made the building glow like something holy. Behind it, the overseer's house, the smokehouse, the barns, and the gin house arranged themselves in careful hierarchy. And beyond those, set back a respectful distance where the smell wouldn't offend, were the quarters. 20 small cabins arranged in 2 rows, each measuring roughly 12 feet by 14 feet. 7 people lived in some of them. The walls were thin, the floors were dirt, and in winter the wind came through gaps in the wood like knives. But they were homes such as could exist in captivity. People made them into something more than the structures deserved. Planting flowers near doorways, hanging curtains made from flour sacks, telling stories at night that transformed bare walls into castles and kingdoms, and places where freedom was more than a dream. Marcus had been born on Henderson property in 1829, the son of a woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house, and a father he never knew. The plantation records listed him simply as boy, property of J. Henderson, born March, strong constitution, value $400. Ruth never spoke about Marcus's father. Not when Marcus was young and asked with innocent curiosity. Not when he grew older and asked with understanding. The silence wasn't protective. It was survival. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, especially when those truths involved white men and enslaved women and the particular horror of coerced intimacy that no law recognized as violence. Marcus grew up in the main house where Ruth worked as a domestic servant. For the first 7 years of his life, he experienced slavery in its most insidious form. Close proximity to comfort he could never claim. He watched Henderson's children eat food that Ruth prepared, but Marcus couldn't touch. He saw them learn to read from books that sat on shelves Marcus dusted but couldn't open. He observed the casual ease with which they moved through the world, never considering that the people who served them might be fully human, with interior lives as rich and complex as their own. By 1855, that value listed in Henderson's ledger had increased to $1,800. Marcus was 26 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that came from a lifetime of physical labor. His hands were scarred from cotton thorns and rough work, but his eyes carried something that Henderson had noted in his private journal with growing unease. Smart beyond what's useful. Watches everything, says little. Must watch this one. Marcus had learned to read from Henderson's daughter Caroline when he was 9 years old. She was 7 and had recently learned herself. And in that brief window before she understood the social order that would define her life, she taught Marcus his letters using a primer behind the horse barn. They met 3 times a week for 3 months. Caroline delighted to have a pupil. Marcus drinking in knowledge like a man dying of thirst. The lessons ended abruptly when Henderson discovered them one afternoon in July. He didn't beat Marcus. The boy was too valuable, and Henderson prided himself on managing assets efficiently. But he did something worse. He sold Marcus' cousin, a girl named Patience, who worked in the kitchen, to a plantation in Mississippi, known for its brutality. Not because Patience had done anything wrong, but to teach Marcus that knowledge had costs, and those costs would be paid by people he loved. Marcus never forgot that lesson, but not in the way Henderson intended. By the time he'd memorized enough to continue on his own, stealing moments with discarded newspapers, studying signs on wagon sides, reading labels on shipping crates when he worked at the loading docks, he became literate in secret, and that literacy would later prove crucial in ways Henderson could never have anticipated. At 19, Marcus married Esther in a ceremony that had no legal standing, but meant everything nonetheless. She was 17, born on a neighboring plantation and purchased by Henderson specifically because Marcus had requested it. Henderson saw it as good management. A married worker was a stable worker. He charged Marcus $20 for the privilege money Marcus had saved over 2 years from selling rabbits he trapped on Sundays, his one day of partial rest. The wedding took place on a Saturday evening in June, officiated by an elderly enslaved man named Daniel, who'd been a preacher before his capture in Africa decades earlier. Daniel couldn't read, but he'd memorized vast passages of the Bible from hearing them read aloud, and he spoke them with authority that made them sound new. Nearly 50 people attended, all enslaved workers from Henderson's plantation and neighboring properties. They sang hymns that blended African rhythms with Christian words, creating something entirely new that belonged to neither continent, but to the liminal space of survival. Esther wore a dress that Ruth had spent 6 months sewing, working by candlelight after her duties were finished. It was made from cotton. What else could it be made from in that place and time? But Ruth had dyed it deep indigo using plants she'd gathered and techniques she'd learned from her own mother. In the evening light, it looked almost purple, almost royal. For a few hours, Esther was the most beautiful woman in Alabama, and the fact that she had no legal right to her own body, no protection under law, no future she could call her own, seemed almost bearable. Samuel was born 10 months later in April of 1852. Marcus held his son for the first time just after dawn. The baby small and perfect and already owned by another man. Esther was exhausted, attended by Ruth and 2 other women who'd helped with the delivery. In that moment, Marcus made a promise that would shape everything that followed. He whispered it into Samuel's ear, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "You won't die here. I swear it." Mary arrived 2 years later in 1854. By then, Marcus had been working in the fields for years, assigned to the cotton harvest crews when he turned 15, and his value as a houseworker diminished. He picked cotton from dawn until dark, his fingers bleeding by the end of each day, his back aching from the bent posture the work required. A good picker could harvest 200 pounds a day. Marcus could do 300, and he hated himself for it. Hated that his body was so efficient at the labor that enriched the man who owned him. But he picked that cotton with singular focus because every pound beyond his quota earned a few pennies, and those pennies accumulated into dollars, and those dollars represented possibility. Marcus lived in a cabin with his mother Ruth, his wife Esther, their 2 children Samuel and Mary, his younger sister Ada, and Ada's husband Thomas. 7 people in a space designed for 4. They slept in shifts during the hottest months, some resting in the cabin while others sat outside to catch any breeze. In winter, they huddled together for warmth, burning wood that Marcus collected on Sundays. The one day each week when they weren't required to work for Henderson, they were together, though, and in the economy of slavery that was a fortune so rare it felt like a gift, even though it should have been a right. Ada was 5 years younger than Marcus, born in 1834. She'd inherited Ruth's quiet grace and developed a gift for healing. Not formal medical training, which was forbidden, but knowledge passed down through generations about which plants could reduce fever, which roots could stop bleeding, which teas could ease pain. Enslaved people rarely saw the plantation doctor unless they were too valuable to lose. So Ada became their physician, treating injuries and illnesses with whatever she could forage from the woods. Thomas had arrived on the plantation in 1850, purchased from an estate sale after his previous owner died bankrupt. He was a skilled carpenter, able to build anything from coffins to cradles with minimal tools. Henderson used his skills constantly, loaning him out to neighboring plantations and taking a portion of Thomas's earnings. Thomas and Ada married in 1851, and if they resented that their marriage had no legal protection, that Henderson could separate them any time he chose, they never spoke it aloud. The 7 of them created a life within the narrow confines of bondage. They told stories to the children, teaching them about a grandmother who'd survived the Middle Passage and remembered Africa. They sang songs in the evenings, voices blending in harmonies that carried across the quarters. They shared food when someone had extra, comforted each other when grief became unbearable, celebrated small joys, a successful harvest, a beautiful sunset, a child's first steps, because joy itself was resistance. But underneath the surface, Marcus was planning, always planning. Everything changed in August of 1855. The first sign of trouble came on a Monday morning when Henderson called Thomas to the main house. Thomas went as he had to and returned 3 hours later looking hollowed out. He gathered Ada and Marcus in the cabin that evening and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I've been sold. Men from Mississippi Plantation near Natchez, leaving in 4 days." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling out in waves of grief and fury. Ada made a sound that wasn't quite human, a keen of loss that made Marcus' chest tight. Esther took Ada's hands. Ruth began to pray, words flowing in languages she'd inherited from ancestors who'd been stolen from places whose names she didn't know. Marcus said nothing. He went outside, walked to the edge of the cotton field, and stood there for hours staring at darkness. 4 days later, Thomas left in a wagon with 3 other recently purchased enslaved people. Ada watched him go, her face expressionless, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury they couldn't afford when anyone might be watching. That night, Marcus lay awake in the cabin, listening to Ada's breathing, too controlled, too measured. He listened to Samuel's soft snoring, to Mary's small sighs. He thought about Thomas in a wagon heading south, probably chained, definitely terrified. He thought about how easily Henderson had severed a marriage that meant everything to the people involved, but nothing to the law. And he decided something had to break, either the system or him. And if he was going to break, he'd do it in a way that mattered. Henderson's finances had deteriorated throughout 1855. Poor cotton yields due to unusual weather. Too much rain in spring, followed by drought in summer. Gambling debts accumulated during trips to Mobile, where Henderson liked to feel important among merchant classmen who tolerated him for his money but didn't respect him. Bad investments in a railroad venture that collapsed when the engineer absconded with investor funds. By autumn, Henderson was cash-starved and increasingly desperate. He began liquidating assets, which meant selling people. Not all at once, which might spark panic and mass escape attempts, but gradually, 1 or 2 every few weeks, breaking up families with the casual cruelty of a man selling furniture to pay rent. In September, Henderson started looking at Marcus' family with new attention. "That boy of yours is valuable," he mentioned to Marcus one morning. "Samuel, he's what, 4 years old? Perfect age for training. I've got a buyer in Mobile interested in young ones for housework, offering good money." Marcus was cleaning equipment in the barn when Henderson said this. He continued working, kept his face neutral, his voice even. "He's young yet, sir. Still learning." "That's the point." Marcus pried it open and found Ruth inside, unconscious, but breathing. He pulled her out, wrapped her in blankets, and placed her carefully in the wagon, filled the coffin with sandbags to maintain weight, rearrayed it. By the time they'd excavated all 12 graves, extracted 12 semi-conscious people, and refilled the graves to look undisturbed, dawn was breaking. They'd been working for 6 hours straight. Marcus looked at the cemetery in the growing light. The graves looked normal, slightly disturbed maybe, but not obviously robbed. It would have to be enough. They transported 12 people to the hidden barn. Dr. Reeves was waiting there with medical supplies, ready to help them recover from the drugs. Over the next 12 hours, all 12 people woke up, disoriented, nauseous, frightened, but alive. Ruth woke and saw Marcus's face and started crying. "You came back. You actually came back." "I promised." "But how?" "Later. Right now, we need to move. Henderson has investigators coming. We have maybe 2 days before they start checking graves and discover they're empty." Simon had 2 wagons ready. They would transport people in groups of 6 hidden beneath false bottoms, traveling north on different routes to avoid suspicion. The first wagon left that evening with Ruth, Ada, and 4 others. The second wagon would leave the following night with the remaining 6. But Henderson moved faster than expected. Party 15th, confront the investigators arrived a day early on April 26 and immediately began their work. They audited Dr. Gaines's records, finding them thorough but suspicious in their sheer volume. 23 deaths in 2 months was extreme even by plantation standards. They interviewed Douglas the undertaker, who nervously confirmed he'd built all the coffins to standard specifications and had no idea why so many people had died recently. They examined the cemetery and noticed something. Several graves showed signs of recent disturbance. The soil was packed differently. The grass hadn't regrown properly. Something was wrong. They ordered graves dug up. By noon, they'd exhumed 3 graves and found them empty except for sandbags and in one case an unidentified body that clearly wasn't the person whose name was on the grave marker. Henderson stared at the empty coffins with an expression that cycled through disbelief, fury, and something close to awe. He actually did it. Marcus actually stole them by making them legally dead. The investigators were already planning their next moves. Alert authorities, organize searches, track down everyone involved in the conspiracy, but they needed warrants, coordination with county officials, time to organize a proper response. Time that Marcus used to run. He'd stationed Aida near town to watch for unusual activity. When she saw the investigators arrive a day early and immediately head to Henderson's plantation, she triggered the emergency signal. A specific arrangement of stones near the road that Marcus checked every hour. He saw it at 100 p.m. and knew immediately they were out of time. He rode to the hidden barn, gathered the 6 people still waiting for transport, and made a desperate decision. We're leaving now. All of us. No more staged transports. We run together or die together. Henderson will send searchers after us. Esther said, I know, but we have a head start and we have something Henderson doesn't expect. What? We're going to use his own paranoia against him. Marcus had prepared for this possibility. He'd created a false trail. Evidence planted at the barn suggesting the escaped people had headed southwest toward Mississippi. Forged documents showing transport arrangements to New Orleans. Fake testimony from a bribed farm worker claiming he'd seen a group heading that direction. While Henderson's searchers followed that trail, Marcus led his group northwest toward Tennessee, using back routes that Simon had mapped months earlier. They traveled by night, hid during day, avoided roads. 12 people moving through Alabama wilderness carrying minimal supplies. Hunted by professional slave catchers who would kill them rather than let them escape. On the 3rd night, they reached the Tennessee border. On the 5th night, they crossed the Tennessee River using a raft that Simon had pre-positioned. On the 7th night, exhausted and terrified and barely holding together, they reached Chattanooga. William Chen was waiting at the boarding house with food, supplies, and news. Henderson's investigators figured out the false trail. They're organizing search parties across the state. You're wanted fugitives now, all of you. Massive rewards. Professional hunters are mobilizing. Then we need to keep moving. Where? North. As far as we can get before they catch us. Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus' group moved through the Underground Railroad network like water flowing downhill, always seeking the path of least resistance. Chattanooga to Nashville, Nashville to Louisville, Louisville to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to Detroit. At each stop, some people chose to settle, finding communities of free black people, establishing new lives, taking new names. By the time they reached Detroit in late May 1856, Marcus' group of 23 had scattered to 10 different cities across 5 states. But they were free. Genuinely, legally free because all of them had death certificates proving they were deceased, which meant they couldn't be claimed as fugitive property. Marcus, Esther, Ruth, Ada, and 3 others settled in Detroit. Marcus took the surname Robinson, suggesting rebirth. He found work at a dockyard, saved money, purchased a small house, and he wrote a letter to an abolitionist network asking if anyone had information about a 4-year-old boy named Samuel, who'd been sold to a buyer in Mobile in October 1855. Henderson never recovered from the events of 1856. His plantation essentially collapsed, workforce depleted, finances devastated. reputation ruined. Other plantation owners whispered about him. How had he lost 23 people? How had someone orchestrated such an elaborate theft under his nose? What did it say about his management? He sold most of his remaining enslaved workers by 1857 and much of his land by 1858. The plantation that had been in his family for 2 generations was broken up and sold piecemeal to pay debts. He died in 1864 during the Civil War of what the doctor called heart failure, but what everyone knew was really despair. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his contributions to the community, but didn't mention the 23 people who'd vanished from his property like ghosts. Dr. Gaines fled to New York in July 1856 when investigators began questioning his role in the mass deaths. He settled in Brooklyn, stopped drinking, and spent the rest of his life working at a charity hospital that served poor immigrants. He never spoke publicly about what he'd done in Alabama, but colleagues noted that he seemed at peace in a way traumatized people rarely achieve. Douglas, the undertaker, was arrested and questioned, but released when investigators couldn't prove he'd knowingly participated in the conspiracy. He continued his business, but never built another coffin with a false bottom. Margaret, the county clerk, was never suspected. She continued filing death certificates according to standard procedures until she retired in 1871. Simon the wagon driver was questioned once, but his permits and documentation were so legitimate that investigators found nothing suspicious. He continued operating his freight business and quietly transporting escaping enslaved people for another 4 years until the Civil War made such work less necessary. The abandoned farm where Marcus had hidden people was investigated thoroughly. Authorities found evidence of occupation, blankets, food supplies, signs of multiple people staying there. But by the time they searched it, everyone was long gone. And the story began to spread. Enslaved people across Alabama heard about it. Whispered in quarters late at night, sung in work songs with coded lyrics, preached in religious services as parables about resurrection. The slave who escaped twice and came back for his family, the man who killed people to bring them back to life. The graves that were doors instead of endings. It became legend, and legends are more powerful than facts because you can't disprove them and you can't stop people from believing. On other plantations, when families faced separation, they would whisper, "Maybe someone will come. Maybe we can die and walk away." Sometimes, inspired by Marcus' success, people tried similar escapes. Most failed, some succeeded. The Underground Railroad began incorporating the technique into their methods, falsifying death records, staging funerals, creating legal ambiguity that made recapture more difficult. And slowly, impossibly, the system began to crack. Not because of one man or one escape or one elaborate conspiracy, but because the story of what Marcus had done proved something essential. The system wasn't invulnerable. It could be beaten. It could be tricked. It could be made to eat itself through its own bureaucratic mechanisms. Every death certificate that was questioned made the system weaker. Every grave that had to be dug up cost money and credibility. Every escaped person who had legal proof of death created a logical paradox that courts struggled to resolve. How do you return someone to slavery if they can prove they're dead? The Civil War would eventually end slavery through military force and constitutional amendment. But before that, people like Marcus were ending it one grave at a time, one forged document at a time, one impossible escape at a time. The historical record for Marcus after 1856 becomes deliberately vague. He appears in Detroit census records in 1860 as Marcus Robinson, Free Eedman, dock worker. A church registry from 1861 shows him renewing marriage vows with Esther. Property records from 1863 show him purchasing land. Military records from the Civil War show Marcus Robinson from Detroit enlisting in the 102nd United States Colored Infantry in 1863. He served as a scout using his knowledge of Alabama to guide Union troops through territory he'd once fled through as a fugitive. His commanding investigating officer noted that Robinson seemed to know every back road, every safe house, every sympathetic farm in 3 counties. Knowledge that proved invaluable during campaigns. He survived the war and returned to Detroit. Census records from 1870 show him living with Esther, Ruth, Ada, and 4 children. Not 2 children. 4. 2 of those children were born after reaching freedom. But census records suggest that the other 2 were Samuel and Mary, which means Marcus somehow located his sold son and brought him north. How he accomplished this, where Samuel had been for those years, what Marcus had to do to get him back, none of this is documented. But Samuel was there. Marcus got him back somehow. Ruth died in 1872, age 67. Surrounded by family. Her obituary mentioned that she'd been born enslaved but died free and that she'd survived an incredible journey from Alabama to Michigan. That sounded too remarkable to be fully true but was documented extensively. Marcus died in 1891, age 62. His obituary in the Detroit Plain Dealer, a black-owned newspaper, mentioned his Civil War service and his work with Underground Railroad networks, but it focused mostly on his role as community leader, church member, and family man. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including dozens who'd known him in Alabama, and remembered the spring of 1856 when dead people walked away from their graves. At the funeral, Marcus's granddaughter, Sarah, asked Esther about the stories she'd heard. Stories that seemed too impossible to be real, but too detailed to be fiction. Did Grandpa really do all those things? The escapes, the fake deaths, coming back for everyone. Esther was 71 years old by then, her hair completely white, her face marked by a lifetime of joy and trauma in equal measure. She considered the question carefully. Your grandfather learned something that powerful people never want powerless people to know, she said finally. He learned that the systems that control us are just stories we've agreed to believe. Documents, certificates, registries. They're all just papers that say a story is true. And if you can tell a better story, if you can make the papers say something different, you can change reality. For 2 years, your grandfather told a story about dead people who weren't actually dead. He made the papers say it. He made the system believe it. And because the system believed it, those people became free. So yes, he did those things. But the real miracle wasn't the escapes or the fake deaths. The real miracle was that he convinced everyone, his enemies, his friends, even sometimes himself, that impossible things were possible if you were brave enough and smart enough and desperate enough to try them. Sarah asked one more question. Do you think anyone else could do what he did? Esther smiled. I think someone is doing it right now. Somewhere, someone is looking at a system that seems unbeatable and thinking, what if I tried anyway? That's all your grandfather did. He tried anyway. And sometimes trying anyway is enough. Final. The cemetery on Henderson's former plantation was demolished in 1947 to make room for a cotton processing facility.